of a good king on an island that ruled once on a time. And as he walked by an apple tree, there came green devils out of the sea, with sea plants trailing heavily and tracts of opal slime. Yet Aelfred is no fairy tale. His days, as our days ran, he also looked forth for an hour on peopled plains and skies that lower from those few windows in the tower that is the head of a man.
Hi, we're Joseph and Isaac, and we're on episode 10 of the Iron Rod podcast. This is the last episode of our current series, the Roots of Liberty series. We were speaking about perhaps the apex of what is called the early Middle Ages, the establishment and ensconcement of empire and kingdom of a Christian nature under two characters, which will be the subject of today's conversation: Charlemagne, Charles the Great, and Aelfred the Great, both with the appellation the Great. We will discuss them in some detail, and we shall soon see if they deserve that appellation. Giving it over to Isaac, I will be just doing Aelfred the Great in general. He'll be starting with Charlemagne, but prior to that, he'll give us a little background.
Alright, so, as my partner said, usually we spoke about civilizations, but now we are returned to our earlier partner speaking about individuals. And the reason is that Aelfred and Charlemagne together invented, essentially, the medieval world. And to a degree you can say that they invented the modern world as we know it today. So just a quick word about the peoples they actually governed, or actually they hailed from. When the Roman Empire fell, a lot of Germanic tribes entered the scenery. Among them we can count three important tribes for our discussion. The Goths, who first some of them cooperated with the Romans, who tried to defend the territory, some of them with the Huns and other invaders, and they often fought the Romans. They got the big prize. They got Italy and Spain. Clearly, the best prizes. Spain was the terminus of all international trade for thousands of years at this point. Italy, of course, was the seat of empire. It was the richest province. Then you have the Franks, who historically have been allies of Rome. They got Gallia, Gaul, not modern-day France, not as rich as Italy, but fairly rich province. And then you have the Saxons. The Saxons are important because they entered Britain, who was the less Romanized and less developed of all the western provinces, as invaders and pirates. And they started settling all around the coast and raiding, and slowly but surely they co-opted or pushed out or destroyed all the native and all the Britannic and Romano-Britannic state or statelets or provinces or garrison cities that the Romans left behind them in Britain after they abandoned it. Because, of course, Britain is the first province to be abandoned by the Romans, who are trying to concentrate their force on as much territory as possible. And for generations, the Franks are ruled by the Franks are ruled by the Merovingian house, who claim descent from a sea monster, most likely the Midgard serpent of Germanic myth, and they cling to this myth even after they convert to Christianity under King Clovis. But eventually they are pushed out of power by a family of noblemen who administered the government, called the Pepinids, who later, after the reign of Charlemagne, are also known as the Carolingian, after this particular individual. The Saxons, on the other hand, are divided into many, many kingdoms, and each kingdom is ruled by its own dynasty. The one that's important to us is the dynasty of the Cedricians, or the Cedricingi, who ruled the land of the Western Saxons, or as they would say it, the West Sax, or in short, Wessex. And this is what you need to know as far as background goes. And now to our intro. Hi, this is the Iron Rod Podcast, and we are finishing our mini-series The Roots of Liberty with a joint episode about Charlemagne and Aelfred the Great. And first I would like to speak about Charlemagne. Why would I like to speak about Charlemagne? Because Charlemagne created the bigger empire, and his empire eventually gave rise to the entire system of government in continental Europe, and later on in England itself, and by extension Scotland and Ireland, and in the Nordic countries. The system we know as feudalism, even though his kingdom cannot be said to be feudal, but it was his system that gave birth to feudalism. And he came first. So he was crowned emperor of the Romans in Christmas 800, and Aelfred the Great would not be born until 848. I'm sorry, 848. So it makes sense that we will speak about Charlemagne first. So who is Charlemagne? Charlemagne is a man who comes from a family of noblemen that his grandfather, Pepin the Pious, essentially deposed the previous king in the previous dynasty with the blessing of the Pope. And he was able to do that because at this point the Merovingian kings were not able to do much. They were basically prisoners in their own palace, and it was basically a formality to get rid of them. A big formality, but a formality nonetheless. So, and Pepin dies, and the kingdom gets split according to the old Frankish tradition between 2 or 3 different kingdoms. Eventually, those kingdoms get coalesced together, and then the king died again, and then his 2 sons, Carloman and Carol, or Carolus, divide the kingdom between themselves. Carolus, which we know later as Charlemagne, gets the north, the kingdom of Neustria, and Carloman gets the south with a little appendage going up to Paris, the official capital. So Charlemagne is the junior king, because those 2 parts of the kingdom are pretty much joined by the hip. The idea is they are brothers, they rule together, each of them is merely administering a different part of the kingdom because it's more efficient this way. And Carloman, who is the older brother, gets Paris, and with it, it's understood that he'll be the senior leader. But then Carloman dies, and you can say that the circumstances were suspicious. They were not suspicious. It's 1,000 years old. People are wagging their tongues since the 700s. So and Charlemagne becomes king of the Franks. Then the Pope calls for help, because just like in the days of Charlemagne's grandfather, he is again being threatened from the north by the kingdom of the Lombards. Now we mentioned how the Franks were allies of Rome, and the Goths were kind of enemies, kind of allies, and took over Italy. The Lombards are an interesting thing, because after the invasion, the attempt by Justinian and Belisarius to reconquer the West for the Eastern Roman Empire, the kingdom of the Ostrogoth, who rules Italy, since the fall of the West in the 400s, is destroyed, and a new tribe called the Langobards, the Longbeards, which later kind of contracts into the term Lombard, appears, and they conquer most of Italy from them. And as the Eastern Roman Empire retreats due to lack of funding and a plague and lack of enthusiasm on the part of the local population, which, by the way, still thinks of itself as Roman, but does not really like those Easterners coming over and setting rules for them. Basically, the Lombards have a free reign to establish a very strong kingdom in the north, and all sorts of little duchies and counties and statelets all over the Italian peninsula. And the Pope, who was of course a Roman relic from the Roman times, feels very threatened by it, and he calls the Franks to help. And that's, by the way, that's what Pepin had to do to gain the papal blessing to depose the Merovingian kings. But then comes the time again, at the time of Charles, when he calls for help. And indeed, Charles comes to the rescue, and he defeats the Lombards, and he's crowned king of the Lombards as well as king of the Franks, and he dons the Iron Crown of Italy, and he spends Christmas of 800 in Rome with the Pope. By the way, this Pope, we mentioned that the Lombards were the problem, but actually this Pope also have a lot of problems domestically in Rome, because the papal election was not done back at the day the way it is done now, in which you have the conclave of cardinals that elect a pope in a fairly regular process. No, the reason you have this regular process nowadays is because all the nonsense that happened during the early to Middle Ages, by which, so the Pope, let's explain the position of the Pope to our non-Catholic audience. The Pope is the head of the Catholic Church. That's what most of us know about it. But of course, he's doing that because he is the Bishop of Rome, and Rome, the Holy See of Rome, is considered to be more elevated than all the other sees in the Catholic world. And the reason is because the Apostle Peter and Paul both traveled there and preached there, etc. And the Pope is considered to be the inheritor to Peter, who was the first Bishop of Rome. And of course, Jesus tells Peter in the Gospel that you are the rock upon which I'll build my church. So, of course, the Protestants and the Orthodox have widely different interpretation to that than the Catholics do, but this is how the Pope established. But the important thing is that the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church because he is the Bishop of Rome. Now, how do you elect bishop in the early Middle Ages? You don't. They are not being appointed by a committee. They are not being appointed by a foreign ruler. Sometimes they do, but the important thing, the election of bishops in early Christianity is an act of free elections by the believers. Sometimes earthly rulers will chime in, because assuming they're Christians themselves. Constantine was prone to do that. The Christian Roman emperors as a whole like to do that. But essentially it is a process by which the believers accept and elevate one of their crowd to become their local head. So, like many things in the Middle Ages, what started as a popular election first became imperial prerogative, and when the empire went away, it became the prerogative of the few aristocratic family who controlled Rome, the politics of the city of Rome at the time. This particular pope has domestic problems. He was elected due to the support of one faction, and he's widely, and the faction opposing him grew very, very strong. Meanwhile, and Charlemagne, who is of course, who may or may not be cognizant of the intricacies of Roman city politics, comes and sort it out for him. And this is and whether the prize of the Empire of the West is negotiated ahead of time, or is the surprise of Charles' surprise at receiving it, doing mass at the on Christmas the year 800 is genuine. It doesn't matter, because that's what it. And why is it so important for the Pope that Charles will become emperor? Because it was understood since the days of Constantine that the emperor of Rome always have some sort of authority over the church. That just like the Pope is the head of the believers in belief, the emperor is the head of the secular Christian world, the head of the laity, if you will. So the Pope has a problem, because the only Roman emperor is of course the Eastern Roman Emperor, and the Eastern Roman Emperor is kind of overbearing, and he has his own position in Italy. And if the Pope and popes before this Pope had to accept the overlordship of the Byzantine Empire, and therefore the Pope decides, if I crown Charles as Emperor of the West, because he ruled the best part of the West, then he is my emperor, and I know that he will be good, to me, that he will not be too intervenous, because his capital is far away. It's in Paris. It's always in Aachen, somewhere in the cold, frozen north. He will go back to his capital. He won't bother me, and he will defend me when times calls for it. It's a win-win situation.
Oh, thank you, Isaac. So we established the most significant aspect of Charlemagne's career, which was going from a semi-pagan barbarian to a Christian barbarian, but to an elevated. But and by doing this, and doing this by his attachment to the Pope, both physical attachment, that he walked into Rome like he owned the place. Rome was, like you mentioned, a very dangerous city, and the elections were a riotous affair. And secondly, the political attachments, by defeating the Lombards, which were the mortal enemy of the secular power of the Papal States.
Mm-hmm.
And thirdly, by creating a legal fiction of a Christian empire on one hand, and as a successor of the Roman Empire on the other, and merging those two into making him the Holy Roman Empire. So that important thing that you mentioned, do you want to also mention a bit his military career, how he expanded the power of the Franks from the borders of Spain, that is to say the Atlantic, all the way to Hungary? Or do you want to gloss over this subject?
Oh, no. That's a very important subject, because Charlemagne, surprisingly enough, does not treat his newfound empire as a fiction. He treats it very seriously, and you can see that before he becomes emperor, his main focus is on consolidating his rule in the Frankish lands and in the Lombard lands. But once he becomes emperor, first of all, you have an overhauling of the political system, the Frankish political system. We mentioned in our Germanic episode, how tribal, about the difference between the theodons of the tribal Germanic structure and the Reichs that you have the sacral kings, and you have the military leaders, and each of them is leading the sacral kings because they descend from the gods, or in the case of the Merovingians it's very pronounced because they claim descent from the Midgard serpent, and the Reichs rule militarily and administratively because they prove themselves capable and fit to the heroic ideal of the Germanic culture. And of course, by the point of time in which we speak, everything is, those two rules merge already. But apart from the fact those two roles merge, and that apart from that, much of the tribal infrastructure is still there, which means people still live tribal life. There's still the flacita, which are some sort of tribal popular assemblies, which resemble what was called in Anglo-Saxon English the moot, or the or in the Nordic lands it was called the thing, or the owl thing, was still in place. And there's no clear differentiation between classes, between estates as they were called, and what Charlemagne does, that he appoints certain of his retainers to be ministeriales. Ministeriales, their job is to take over a certain territory, and they administer it for the king, in the name of the king, and they completely depend of the king. They cannot get married without the king's permission. They cannot sell away the land, because they are the servant of the king directly. So this is not feudalism, in which the vassal is considered to be an independent entity that just happened to lease to get land in which he's free to exploit as long as he helped the king. No, the ministeriales and the missi are clearly court officials of the crown that administer it. They are allowed to receive the benefit. That's why we call it, in historical analysis, we call it the beneficiary system or the beneficer system. But they ultimately depend on the goodwill of the king. In other words, he's trying to re-establish some sort of the semi-bureaucratic rule of the late Roman Empire, which he understands he doesn't have the infrastructure, the educational infrastructure, to create a bureaucratic state, but he actually is trying to do that, and because he takes the holy part of the Holy Roman Empire very seriously. He's trying to expand the border of the Christian lands, both to the west against the Muslims in Spain, and both to the east against both the pagan, the still pagan Germanics in Saxony, and not to the Saxons of Saxony, not to be confused with the Saxons of England or the Christian, and against the Avars in Hungary, who of course on occasion raid as far as Bordeaux in western France at times. So
let me first mention, when I speak about legal fictions and legal, so one of the things about Charlemagne, he instituted and he inaugurated a Renaissance, which almost disintegrated after his death, as we'll see similar with Aelfred the Great, and that he himself centered upon himself a great deal of learning, both in his court, in his royal court, and he himself learning grammar and rhetoric and so on. But he was a legal expert in that his father, who was less of a legal expert than him, had been bamboozled. His father, Pepin the Short, son of Charles Martel, who defeated the Arab hordes pouring in from Spain, and thus
at the Battle of Poitiers. By the way, I would like to point.
You were mentioning before.
I would like to point out that I made a mistake. I thought that I said Pepin was his grandfather. Pepin was his father. Charles Martel was his grandfather.
So his father had been bamboozled by the Pope with this fictional and yet very pervasive medieval fiction called the Donation of Constantine, which maybe we'll talk about at some other time when we speak more about Christianity, but managed to make the Pope is an authority over the
Italian imperial
over the earthly secular forces. And Charlemagne didn't accept this, and he managed to not bend the knee at all to the Pope. And even though the Pope did catch him by surprise by conning him when he walks out of his cave to visit to pay pilgrimage, always a neat trick when you're coming out of a cave and you're blinkered by the sun, and the Pope just sneaks up on you and puts the crown, which had been unused for centuries, on your head. But he didn't allow himself to be bamboozled by this fiction of the nation of Constantine. As far as the legal fiction, I would want to quote here Bertrand Russell, who says, and with this we will wrap up, I believe, the Charlemagne era and move to Alfred the Great in our next segment. So I would just mention in passing, he said, the foundation of the Holy Roman Empire marks an epoch in medieval theory, though much less in medieval practice. The Middle Ages were peculiarly addicted to legal fictions, and until this time the fiction had persisted that the western provinces of the former Roman Empire were still subject de jure to the emperor in Constantinople, who was regarded as the sole source of legal authority. Charlemagne, an adept in legal fictions, maintained that the throne of the empire was vacant because the reigning eastern sovereign, Irene, who called herself emperor, not empress, was a usurper, since no woman could be emperor. Charles derived his claim to legitimacy from the Pope. So, etc., etc. So we see, and also as far as his military campaigns, he's very famous for his campaigns against the Saxons, like we mentioned, 18 invasions of Saxony, and which indirectly caused the great Viking excursion that Aelfred the Great had to deal with half a century later.
May or may not.
May or may not, but because the Saxons were until then busy fighting the Nordic peoples, and now all of a sudden there are no Saxons left to fight them. But the last 10 years of his empire was dedicated to fighting the Byzantine Empire for legitimacy, and eventually she did acknowledge that he was emperor, and she allowed him to use that title.
Due to her own domestic problems, which again stemmed from the fact she was a woman.
Yes, but she was also being
and you know, and she murdered her husband and she murdered her son. Both were emperors on that time, and she was not very popular.
I would almost say perhaps she was a tyrant. Perhaps she deserves her own episode.
Oh yeah, definitely. When we do we should do at least a couple of Byzantine episodes. But
so perhaps we'll do one on Empress or Emperor Irene. So before we wrap up on this segment of the Iron Rod podcast, do you want to mention anything else on Charlemagne before we move to Alfred the Great?
Yeah, you mentioned his vast learning renaissance. He actually he started establishing monastic schools over his realm, in which children of the commonality, and not only children of courtiers and priests, because priests could still marry then, would be encouraged to study. Even children of peasants, which, by the way, were not serfs yet, and he would once visit. It is said by Einhard, his biographer, that knew him personally, that he once visited such a monastic school, and he actually administered a surprise exam, and the children who didn't pass, he separated the children who passed the exam to his satisfaction, to children who did not, and he praised and rewarded the children who passed, and he admonished the children who did not. And so, why is that? Some people say that he was simply a man who loved learning, and he was a good Christian, and he wanted to give his subjects a good understanding of Christianity. It's possible. It's certainly in character for him, as to borrow a phrase, but we hinted that he really took seriously the idea of restoring the empire in the West. To restore the empire in the West, you needed to restore its bureaucratic function. The problem was he had a deficit of people who can read and write. Obviously, if you have such a problem, you want to start building a foundation to create some people of learning. A network of monastic schools educating people from all walks of life sounds like a good start. And I think this is the end of this segment. And next time, and by the next segment, after the intro, we'll return with Joseph's narrative of the life of Aelfred the Great.
Hi, this is Joseph, and we're doing the Iron Rod Podcast, episode 10. We just went over Charlemagne, another great king, Aelfred the Great, bears mentioning. Let me begin with his story. The year is 878 AD. The place is England, specifically an island in the swamps of England. The person is Aelfred. Aelfred the Great, according to legend, which we will now recount with a ballad from Chesterton, is sitting there all by himself in some very deserted part of this swampy area in the middle of his overrun and defeated kingdom. He seemed a beggar such as lags, looking for crusts and ale, and the woman with a woman's eyes of pity and once an ire said, when that she had cleared a span, there is cake for any man if you watch the fire. So Aelfred the Great, one of the great men to ever live, got the job of watching the cake for this lady who had to go take care of business. And Aelfred, bowing heavily, sat down the fire to stir, and even as the women pitied him, so did he pity her. And to make a long story short, he wept for the woman, he let her business be, and like his royal oath and rash, the good food fell upon the ash, and blackened instantly. The cake was no more, in dire straits, like his kingdom, and like the future of Christianity in the West, at the risk of being histrionic. Screaming, the woman caught a cake, yet burning from the bar, and struck him suddenly on the face, leaving a scarlet scar. But soon the story was turned around, and the poem has it very soon subsequently that he defeated his Viking foes. So this is the famous story. So how did Aelfred the Great get in this untimely situation? And who was he, and why was he so important, and why is he the only English king with that moniker? Let's do a little bit of background story. Here in the Iron Rod Podcast, we do like busting a myths. One of the possible myths, although this isn't entirely clear, is that the Romans abandoned Britain. Let me, in this extent, bring Aelfred the Great's chronicles, which were a sort of history, a sort of year-by-year explanation. It begins with the beginning of the Roman conquest, and it ends a couple hundred years after Aelfred the Great's death, after the Normans had conquered the place from the Saxons. And it was updated on a routine basis, probably, although somewhat sporadically. The great work had been done by Aelfred, or by Aelfred's court, discussing that history of the kingdom. And for the year, traditionally, it's been understood that the Romans abandoned England when their empire was crumbling in the year 400. Yet we see in the Chronicles, the year 418. This year the Romans collected all the hoards of gold that were in Britain, and some they hid in the earth, so that no man afterwards might find them, and some they carried away with them into Gaul. So firstly, this is 418, a little later, and they very wisely hid all the gold. I would definitely have been tempted to do that myself. But then we see a bit later, in 435, this year the Goths sacked the city of Rome, and never since have the Romans reigned in Britain. So it sounds like there were, in that 17-year period afterwards, perhaps Romans there. So there is a possible theory that the Romans withdrew troops gradually from Britain, but the prevailing theory is, as my esteemed co-host mentioned before, that the Romans abandoned it because they realized they needed the troops to fight the Germans and so on in the main place. The Romans had created a vacuum which had been speedily occupied by the Saxons from Europe, and that is why the Anglo-Saxons, 300 or so years later, were the dominant force. And they were called the Anglo-Saxons by Aelfred the Great. He styled himself as king of the Anglo-Saxons.
And that is because the groups that invaded the province of Britannia were made out of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. And of course, the Angles and Saxons and also the Frisians, but nobody talk about the Frisians because nobody cares about the Frisians. Who cares about the Frisians? Do you care about the Frisians? I certainly don't care. Anyhow,
we discussed this in our previous episode. You should go listen to all of our previous episodes. We're in episode 10. So the Anglo-Saxons, dominant force, were now under tremendous strain from their Viking opponents. Aelfred the Great was born into that war. His father had fought it before him. His older brothers who had ruled before him, to the extent that no one thought he, who had 4 older brothers, would become king. Interestingly enough, it is recorded that when he, as a child, visited Rome, he, like Charlemagne, having a close association with that city, he was crowned king. But that, again, is a bit murky in the details as to its meaning. His brother was possibly dead from wounds suffered in battle. Aelfred the Great, this sort of bookish, intellectual, though very capable person to control. And in 878, when he thought all was safe, and let me read directly from the Chronicles, which we discussed as a history book, put together mostly by Aelfred the Great and his scholars. The year about midwinter after Twelfth Night, the Danish army stole out of Chippenham and rode over the land of the West Saxons, where they settled and drove many of the people over the sea, and of the rest the greatest part they rode down and subdued to their will. Doesn't sound good at all for the Saxons, or the West Saxons, or Wessex, as Aelfred the Great's initial kingdom was called. All but Aelfred the King, he with a little band, uneasily sought the woods and fastness of the moors. So he's there to hide out and seek safety. But from there, from this solitude, he managed to call his thirds, and in the Easter of this year, King Aelfred, with his little force, raised the work at Athelney, from which he assailed the army, assisted by that part of Somersetshire, which he was nighest to it. And soon thereafter, he came out with all of his people from that place and Wiltshire and part of Hampshire, and they rejoiced to see him. And then within one night he went from this retreat to Hay, and within one night after he besieged the Hannington. There he fought with all the army, and he put them as the Vikings, to flight. Right after them, as far as their fortress, he remained a fortnight. Then the army gave him hostages with many oaths, so they would go out of his kingdom. In other words, he once defeated them so successfully that they gave him hostages, and they made oaths, and as the Chronicle subsequently tells us, they also were baptized. So they converted to Christianity, and this is part of Aelfred's plan to calm his former enemies, the Vikings. Allow me to also give a description of the Vikings, these Norse individuals, Danes and Norwegians and general Scandinavians, but we call them Vikings for short, from a book, fantastic book, called King Solomon's Mines. The main character is describing somebody. He says, "One, a gentleman of about 30, was perhaps the biggest chested and longest armed man I ever saw. He had yellow hair, a thick yellow beard, clear-cut features, and large grey eyes set deep in his head. I never saw a finer looking man. And somehow he reminded me of an ancient Dane. They were drinking out of big horns, these ancient Danes, and their long hair hung down their backs. And as I looked at my friend standing there by the companion ladder, I thought that if he only let his hair grow a little, put one of those chain shirts to his great shoulders, and took hold of a battle axe and a horn mug, he might have sat as a model for that picture." That is a description. The skin color is a bit off, as the editor mentions in his notes, because they were more, not the skin color, the hair color, as they were more dark-haired people. But that sort of fearsomeness is something that would be conjured up when you think of Danes. Let me mention one more thing that King Aelfred did in his great career of first holding back these Viking invaders and eventually defeating them to the point that the situation changed from them being the dominant force of England, controlling almost all of the East and Middle England, all the way to Wessex, which was just a narrow strip on the bottom, into that fateful
a very fertile
winter.
and rich strip, but yes.
All the way to so to turn that event to him becoming the dominant force and his son controlling most of England and his grandson rightfully saying about himself that he was the king of Britons. His greatest tribulation after this famous one with the cakes was when a final great invasion took place. The chronicles tell us that there was 2 gigantic flotillas. In total, 330 Viking ships from mainland Europe going to invade England. This is in addition to the Vikings already in other parts of England that would coordinate with these armadas. If a Viking ship has around 40 warriors, that math times 330 would tell us that there were 13,200 strong. As against that, you have to say that they brought their wives and children, so it would have been much more crowded. But at the same time, that's only an average size Viking ship. Some have a little less, and many more had greater capacity. So, just as a ballpark, there was between 10 and 20,000 Vikings on this great campaign. And the fact that he was able to defeat part of them and contain the other part and drive them out was his great success. In no less due to his credit as an organizer, as someone who organized the Fyrd, which was, as we mentioned, the national militia of the country, his creation of the burgs, which were these posts, strongholds. No longer could the Vikings use the pillage that they got to feed themselves. These fortified posts meant that the cattle of the surrounding area was driven in along with the people, and they could hold fast, which prevented the enemy from replenishing themselves off the enemy provisions and so on. And by these and other military and administrative reforms, he was able to put perhaps 20,000, 30,000 men in the field, and with his fortifications was able to hold off these Viking hordes, and for that he is rightly considered Aelfred the Great.
So, this is the story of Aelfred. Some interesting notes about England at the time of Aelfred, which serves as a background. We mentioned how the Saxons conquered the province of Britannia, but they didn't conquer it in one piece, in one fell swoop. The reason that the Anglo-Saxons were divided into 7 or 8 kingdoms was because they conquered it in pieces. Each piece represents another marginal expedition on top of the initial expedition that conquered the shore. And indeed, at the beginning, you have the East being conquered first. You have the kingdom of East Anglia, you have the kingdom of Northumbria, you have the kingdom of Kent. And then they move further and further into the West. Then you have the kingdom of Mercia. Probably the last kingdom to be established was the kingdom of Wessex. This was the kingdom that was the least Saxonized, you might say. I have heard theories that the Western Saxons were not as much a Saxon kingdom as much as a Britannic kingdom with which got Saxonized and got itself a Saxon chief to lead it, which may or may not be true. But it's interesting because when the Northmen came in, when the Danes came in, they followed a similar route. First, Northumbria fell first, and then Mercia and East Anglia. As a matter of fact, in Battle of Athelney, the leader of the Danes is Guthrum, king of East Anglia, the Viking, the Norse king of East Anglia. And in all these places, the Norsemen are either establishing themselves as kings but ruling through a Saxon aristocracy or a semi-Saxon aristocracy, or they just acting as overlords through through Saxon kings of their choosing. Either way, it's not. Either way, the idea is that what are the Saxons trying to save during the 5 lifetimes between the generations of Alfred's grandfather Egbert and the generation of his grandson what are they trying to save? What are they trying to achieve? Because the Norsemen are not about to genocide them. It's not their style. It's not because they are merciful or something like that. It didn't occur to them. Why would you kill all these very useful people that can work for you and give you tribute and show you where all the good stuff is hidden, and and as Shakespeare put it, which field is good, which field good, and which feels bad, and why would you kill all those fine-looking young women which you can marry? Why would you kill all these all these potential slaves and all these potential serfs? Why? Why would you? It's much more practical to settle in, replace or co-opt the nobility, and enjoy the fat, rich life of a foreign conqueror, which is exactly what the Saxons did a few centuries before. So what are they? So they are not trying even to save the Saxon state structure, because the Norsemen, who did not have much of a state structure themselves, were very happy to co-opt it and exploit it. What are they trying to save? They're trying to save Christianity, but not Christianity as a personal religion, because the Danes who did not have problem with anybody worshipping any kind of spirit or god or whatever that he wishes to, but Christianity, they're trying to save Christianity as the public mores, as the idea that England is a Christian land, and England was a very Christian land before Aelfred. In the generation of Charlemagne, England was already known on the continent as the island of scholars. One of the greatest scholars that Charlemagne invites to his kingdom is Bede the Venerable, or Bede of Northumbria, and who actually wrote a few great works of theology and history. And the thing is, the Danes start their conquest by looting and destroying the great monastery in Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria. In the eyes of the Christian Saxons, this is horror of horrors. And even when they learn of the Danes' way, that the Danes are not literally demons, it's not much comfort, because what the Danes want is a land in which one may worship Christ, but where the prevailing morality and the prevailing ideals will not be the Christian ideals of charity and grace and loving one's neighbor. Those won't be. Those may be preached in person, in private, but ultimately the prevailing ideals would be those that they themselves espouse. The heroic old Germanic ideas of admiration for strength of arms, and worshipping the ancestors as examples of the strength of arms, and that might makes right. And yes, of course, the Saxon kingdoms were not free of exploiting the weak and oppressing the poor, but those were not the prevailing values of society. And that's why, so obviously, Aelfred and all his allies are fighting to maintain their own dominance, but the reason, and they want their land to be a Christian land because they are Christians. But ultimately, what was at stake was more than the question: would we have an Archbishop of Canterbury, or would we have a High Priest of Thor in Canterbury? Ultimately, the question was about the entire not about power, but the entire framework of life for someone who believe, for someone like Aelfred living in an England which would have been Danicized, would have been unthinkable, and this is why he fought. He could have just settled just as easily. He could have settled as a puppet king and maintain his position and his power, but it was unthinkable to him. And this will be the end of this segment, I think.
We will see you again on the other side in the next segment on the Iron Rod Podcast.
When God inspired us for the fight, their ranks were broken, their lines were forced, their ships were shattered in our sight, or swiftly driven from our coast.
Hi, this is the third segment of our 10th episode. We made it this far, and we are speaking about the Dark Ages, and we mentioned Charlemagne and Aelfred the Great. And now that we've covered those bastions of pre-state or prototype state, kingdom and state and empire civilization, how do we go from there to the English state, Isaac?
Well, the important thing about Charlemagne's empire is that it did not survive long after his death. It survived 3 or 4 generations, if I'm not mistaken, until, actually no, 3 generations as a unified empire. First, when he died, his sons divided his kingdom between them. One became the king of the Western Franks, the one became king of the Eastern Frank, which was largely newly conquered territory from the Saxons. One became the king of Italy and a very long and narrow strip of land along the Rhine, which was named Lotharingia after him, and the kingdom of Lothair. And the emperorship was exchanged between the rulers of those kingdoms, and those kingdoms, of course, fought with each other, but the empire survived for a while. But eventually, the inner squabblings of all these kingdoms doomed them, and the kingdom of the Eastern Francia and the empire fell to disrepair. The Eastern Franks developed an identity as Germans, and eventually the Saxons themselves, the Christianized Saxons, came into power in the Kingdom of Germany, and under Henry the Fowler and the Ottonian house descending from him, they claimed power in Italy, and they were declared the heads of the Holy Roman Empire, which did not include France, which included the kingdoms of Germany and the kingdom of Italy. Now, what we see that happened, and over those years, what happened on the continent was that the old beneficiary system was replaced in the long years of civil wars, and the ties between the king and his ministeriales and his missi became weaker and weaker, and we had the new feudal system in which the vassal, which is a Celtic word meaning something like a servant, becomes an almost independent lord, someone who basically is not the servant of the king as much as he is someone whom the king is in a contractual relationship with. He is subservient to the king in the sense that he holds his land in trust from the king, and in exchange of his promise to aid and counsel the king in war and peace. But he is not the king's servant. He can rule those lands however he sees fit. He can marry without the king's consent. He can do basically whatever he wants. And we see the slow but sure degradation of the people, of the common people, into serfdom. Even the only place which is safe from this degradation the people of the towns, because the people of the towns very soon discovered that they are in the towns. Towns have walls. So even if the king impose upon them an external lord, that lord either is being co-opted into the kind of government that the townspeople would like to maintain. Oh, and of course, because the stringencies of the pre-modern economy, there are not that many people in each given town. So, and of course, when you don't have that many people in each given town, it's very easy to coordinate some sort of to coordinate in terms of government. It's almost as and when you can so if you are some unfortunate lord sent in by given a town to govern by a king, you can be very easily surrounded and isolated, and you have two options: either you are being killed off, or you are being sent off, or you are given an option to be to have you and your office co-opted into the new system of government. And we see, for example, the Italian towns, the doges, the dukes appointed by kings and emperors to rule cities eventually becomes elective offices, but elective offices for life, but much restrained by the constitutions of those Italian city-states. We see how in Germany it's more common to see burgomeisters, which are elected either for life or for a limited term, or the people of the town council are taking turns being the burgomaster, and eventually they are securing from the emperor charters making their city a free city, which is subject only to the will of the emperor alone and not to any lords outside of it. But essentially the structure of the Holy Roman Empire and of France is of almost independent lords ruling almost enslaved serfs with almost independent towns besides them. And of course, from time to time, a serf would escape to the city, and you are not getting this one back. Because, and eventually that becomes law, that if a serf spends 12 months in a city, he becomes a free man. Not that anybody cared if there was no law, because you try to besiege a town, using to besiege a walled city without gunpowder weapons, just to get one escaped serf away. It's just not worth the expense. Meanwhile, in England, the things are not as bad for the common people as they are on the continent, because the England was forged not by the strength but by weakness, by the meekness, and because ultimately the unifying experience of the English is very different from that of the Franks. In the Franks, it's almost the traditional trajectory of a heroic Germanic king. You have a great hero. He conquers everybody around him. He achieves the goal of he achieves his goals, and he forges a kingdom, a very strong kingdom, and then he imposes his will within this kingdom. In England, there is much more Christian environment, because England is almost wiped out as an England, and then King Aelfred is managed to beat back the hordes, and when he beat back the hordes, when he takes over the government of the other English kingdoms like Mercia or East Anglia, he does not rule them directly. He never declares himself king of the English. He declares himself he maintained being king of Wessex, but he installs people loyal to him as kings of the newly reconquered English thrones. For example, his daughter becomes Lady of the he marries her to a nobleman who becomes the king of Mercia, and eventually he dies, and she becomes Lady of the Mercians, and she leads the Mercians in war and in peace. East Anglia is ruled by Guthrum, who was the Danish world he faced in Athelney and who converted to Christianity. And so the England retains much of its decentralized character for a while, and the common people do not become serfs. Some of them are thralls, but that's an old system. But the common yeoman remains a yeoman, and he have a word in his own ruling. The earls are just rich and important people, but they do not have it's not the entire kingdom that divided into earldoms. It's that but eventually England survives while the empire of Charlemagne does not. And as a result, by the time of the Norman conquest, France is the more decentralized kingdom, but England is the most centralized kingdom in Europe, and it has the best tax system in Europe, and that's why it's such a desirable target to a particular French lord named William the Conqueror, descendant himself of Northmen, also therefore the name of his estate Normandy, and he has a somewhat shaky claim on the English throne, but he gets the blessing of the Pope, and therefore he becomes as William the Conqueror in the Battle of Hastings, and he imposes on England something which is in France at this point is just legal fiction, but in England it turns into a reality because England is already a centralized state, which is feudalism, which is that all the lords in the land are very strong in their own lands, but in relation to the king they are very weak. In relation to the king, they are the king's servants and vassals and underlings. He managed, and therefore the Norman England becomes the strongest kingdom in the strongest kingdom both internally and externally in the entirety of Europe. But the way you can achieve that is because England could survive to become a centralized state and eventually fall prey to Norman feudalism because it began as such a decentralized state, and the vision of the king never truly transformed itself on the continent or in England. In England, it's still understood that the king is an instrument of God. On the continent, the king is much more than just a mere instrument of God. He is a representative of God on earth, almost equal to the Pope. And that might be the reason, if you notice, that on the continent, states tend to be more... the power of the central government tend to be more revered. England has centralized periods, but the power of the crown was not as revered as on the continent. There are much more centrifugal forces in England than on the continent, and this is how we see the three great legacies: the Greco-Roman legacy, and the Judeo-Christian legacy, and the Germanic legacy come together in the medieval world, in which on the continent is more Roman and is almost equal times Roman and Germanic, with Christianity being the religion and being the flourish, and England being a much more Judaic and Germanic at the same time, with the Roman element being being important, but not as important as this, being almost used as a flourish.
And that's what brings us to the modern conception of liberty, and that is a culmination of our liberty series and of our meta-analysis of, as you mentioned, the Germans, the Greco-Hellenic, and the Jewish influence on liberty. I would say, incidentally, you mentioned William the Conqueror. I'm not sure if we mentioned Aelfred the Great dies, let's say, in the year 900 AD. William the Conqueror conquers England 166 years later. William the Conqueror, in addition to getting sanction from the Pope, also marries Matilda of Flanders. And the reason he does this, in part, because she is a descendant, maybe 6 or 7 greats, count them up, of Aelfred the Great, ostensibly. And that gives him, in addition to a conversation with another prior king of England who bequeathed him the kingdom, but that is also shaky grounds. But this marriage with Matilda gives him additional, albeit shaky, grounds to the throne of England. Naturally, all these shaky grounds don't matter as much as his army of mailed knights and spearmen and so on, which he uses to defeat King Harold. But so great, let's say, is the influence of Aelfred the Great that having a wife who is descendant of him from all the generations back is significant. So I would say mention that in passing. Another thing mentioned in passing, you mentioned before how Charlemagne's empire had divided partially into a German section. So I would mention that the Germans haven't forgotten this at all. Quoting here from Bertrand Russell's book, he says that the resurrection of Prussia under Bismarck appeared as a revival of the heroic past of Barbarossa and Charlemagne, and so on. And then he says in parentheses, to Germans, Charlemagne is a German, not a Frenchman. The whole country of France and intellectuals all over would be a little bit confused by that. Charlemagne are the Franks, but that is so. So, definitely, I think Charlemagne and Aelfred the Great, heroic figures. It is often discussed, what the power of one man can have in terms of versus his society. I think in both of these cases, it was their individual genius and capacity for hard work which led to great things happening using the machinery available to them. That would be my sense. Perhaps you have a different thought. But moving along...
Not at all. Not at all.
All right. So we both... sometimes... and I would also mention in a final passing that the England of Aelfred the Great is really the England of today. In many respects. And maybe over time we'll see that. And different than other English monarchs who were overseeing the great things their country did, but did not actually do those things themselves. And by that I mean the army that defeated Napoleon in battle was the army of King George III, but that was not the army he created.
Absolutely, he was and at the time of them defeating Napoleon, he was busy being mad and blind. And
yes, but he did not create the army. Queen Elizabeth did not create the navy that defeated the Spanish Armada. If anything, she almost prevented that navy from doing the good work of defeating the Armada by only providing 1 day of gunpowder per day in battle. Hopefully we'll have to discuss her tyranny and her 4,000 dresses some other time. Very interesting, stellar character. But she's not responsible for the most important thing that happened in her reign, which was the defeat of the Armada. But my point is, Aelfred the Great is responsible for the most important thing that happened during his reign, which is the defeat of the hordes he was fighting.
Yes, and so did his son. And so did his son Edmund Ironside.
Yeah, and we also mentioned his grandson Ethelson.
Yes,
and also very important women involved. You talked about his daughter, who was
the Lady of the Mercians.
Yeah, very successful in rallying the troops, and should have more of a spotlight shine on her. So, now that we mentioned that, let's move to our announcement. Isaac, do you want to give something of our announcement away?
So, this concludes the first season of the Iron Rod podcast. And we will return to you shortly with our second season, which will include a discussion of current events. Because as you know, we are not just a history podcast. We are a podcast dedicated to liberty and tyranny. And because of that, we examine it through the prism of history and of biography, but also of literature and poetry and the more modern art of cinematography and television, but also through current event. And of course, the most important event of our time, I believe, is the war currently being waged in Eastern Europe, and this ties directly to the two greatest tyrannical figures of our times, which are Vladimir Putin, who is a very interesting study in one man imposing his will upon a great state, and Xi Jinping, who is the story of a tyrant rising out of an oligarchy. Because while Putin have destroyed a budding democracy and turned it into
Wasteland?
What?
Wasteland?
I would say he turned into a land in which his will alone matters in government, but the Russian people, at least until February of this year, still had many rights to be associated with the West and with freedom and with democracy. Of course, the report says that things changed drastically since the war have begun. But Xi Jinping took a country which was with a very tyrannical government, but which insisted of never ever again having a single tyrant, since Mao did tremendous damage to the country, but to rule in an oligarchic style, in an oligarchic manner, of a very narrow circle, and he managed to impose his will upon this circle and almost bamboozle them into giving him ultimate power. So we'll discuss all of it, and we will discuss a very important man that sacrificed his life to prevent the rise, or to counter the rise of those tyrants.
So let's make a program update in this respect, that we will continue doing these historical standalone podcast episodes, which will be devoid of the politics of the current day, in as much as that can possibly be done. In other words, what we've been doing for the past 10 episodes. And we will also have episodes that are standalone and will be entirely political. So going forward, our current plan is to have episodes, as we've been doing them, entirely historical, philosophical, and those that are current events, with, of course, a background in philosophy and history.
That's good. One more thing. Our movie recommendation.
We have a couple of recommendations. So firstly, with a movie recommendation, Isaac.
First, I would like to highly recommend the entirety of the excellent TV show available on Netflix, The Last Kingdom, which deals directly with the reign of Aelfred and with his immediate successors. A very good one. I haven't seen the last season, but I hear it's also good.
In that vein, I would recommend the books upon which those are based upon. So I have not seen the TV, but I've read many of those books by Bernard Cornwell, great British novelist.
One of the greatest living authors of our time, besides Neil Stevenson.
Oh, not faint praise indeed. So the books and the show, highly recommended by the podcast hosts here. Anything else on the TV, or should I move on to my other recommendation?
Move to your other recommendation.
So my others in...
Avoid the later seasons of Vikings, for the love of God, and don't take Vikings as a historically even approximate to accurate source. But go ahead.
Yeah, so we give cultural information, but we also tell you which of that is accurate and which is not. So you get very high degree of of useful knowledge in our shows. Speaking of useful knowledge, so a great, perhaps the best introduction for young people into Aelfred the Great and the Vikings is the Assassin's Creed game, the most recent one on that subject. And I'm even going to give some video game advice. Are you ready for this, Isaac?
Absolutely. I'm not going to play it either way.
So the video game advice, so usually the way it works in Assassin's Creed, if you're playing regularly, is that you could only stay in certain areas, because if you venture far afield, you're going to meet enemies that are 5, 10, 40 levels above you, and they'll kill you in one shot, and if you shoot them 1,000 times, it'll do minimal damage. So that the game forces you to do that. Unlike in the most recent Assassin's Creed with the Vikings, where you could venture out, and this is what I would suggest. I did this. I would suggest this if you are fairly good. Once you get to some bare minimum level with good enough weapons, attack all the monasteries, which have great treasures. Be careful not to be killed, because most opponents will kill you in 1 or 2 shots, but you can still do tremendous damage in return, even if there are legions of levels above you.
Mm-hmm.
So by doing that, you could kind of asymmetrically attack the game in a way you couldn't do with previous levels. The game introduces you to the Vikings, to Aelfred the Great, to some of the events we even talked about, to Aelfred the Great having to bribe the Vikings to leave him alone, for example, something we didn't even mention in our episode. It speaks of many of the great things, and it speaks about things we've talked about previous in our podcast, Viking and Germanic mythology and religion and so on. So it's full of exciting stuff, and full of I would suggest now spending the 1,000 hours it takes to finish the game. I have not finished the game, but it is definitely a way to get young people excited about this important era.
Very good. And with that, I think we are done.
We will see you in the next episode.
The next episode.